Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I'm Gabby, South Pole's Marketing and Communications Specialist for APAC, and I'll be behind the scenes moderating today's webinar. While we just wait for everyone to join us, I'll go through some housekeeping rules for you all. So as attendees, you're all on mute at the moment. So if you've got a question or a comment, please just submit it through the question box on your control panel. And if you experience any technical difficulties, please reach out and we'll do our best to support you in resolving those. We'll aim to answer the questions on the presentation in the Q&A at the end of the webinar. However, we do have a record number of people registered for today's climate chatter, so we might not be able to answer all of them, so apologies in advance for that. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to you within the week, along with a link to download the presentation slides. Last but not least, many of us are broadcasting from home today, so please bear with us in case there are any technical hiccups, which we'll aim to resolve as soon as possible. So today I'm joined in our South Pole Sydney office by Leah and John, and of course we've checked our office is social distancing compliant. But before we introduce our other guest speakers, I'd like to begin today's climate chatter by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which John, Leah and I meet today, and that's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Right, I'll now hand things over to Leah, our host for today.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you everyone for joining us for our webinar on carbon pricing and carbon credits today. Given that we had over 500 registrations for this webinar, I believe many of you might have read in the news that the carbon markets grew dramatically in 2019, by 34% to be exact. Now, some of you might be wondering why the carbon market grew so much. What does this mean for your business operations? And how can companies participate? These questions and many more will be answered in today's webinar. Before we get into it, I would like to briefly introduce South Pole's role within this. South Pole was founded in 2006 and is the largest developer of emission reduction projects globally. Besides offering carbon credits from our portfolio of over 700 projects, South Pole also advises companies on emission reduction strategies and targets, as well as the impact of carbon policies or business operations. In my role as VD Manager for Asia, I have seen a lot of growth in the carbon market in this region over the past 6 months. So I'm really excited that with us today are some of our most senior carbon experts. I'm delighted to introduce to you John Davis, our expert for the voluntary offsetting market, and Jeff Swartz, our carbon pricing expert who joins us from London. Also joining us today is Peter Zaman, partner at Reed Smith Singapore. Peter is a senior carbon specialist whose expertise extends to all aspects of carbon finance, emission trading, carbon funds, and the voluntary market. I'll now hand over things to John to give you an overview of climate ambitions and trends in our region. The stage is yours, John.
Thanks, Leah, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thanks to everyone who's tuned into the webinar. It's fantastic to see such a wide variety of listeners from a diverse range of locations. We've got attendees as far afield as Argentina and as close as Vietnam. Hello to a large Australian contingent. We hope you find this useful. And a quick shout out to Kyle in Finland, and our friends patching in from close to our South Pole headquarters in Zurich, including David. As Leah mentioned, I lead our commercial strategy across the APAC region, and I've worked in a number of roles with South Pole over the last 4 years. In the next 10 minutes, I want to try and express to you how the climate ambition within the APAC region is changing, why voluntary carbon is important, and the trends we're witnessing in the market. Regardless of your own carbon reduction route that you've mapped, it's important to keep in mind that globally and in the APAC region countries, companies and consumers are trending towards net zero emissions. This is happening and this is real, and in a number of countries, it's law. So whether you follow the science-based targets, report to GRESB, or mitigate climate risks via TCFD reporting, globally, the consensus is that emissions must fall, and we are starting to see this knock-on effect in the APAC market. So what are the drivers in this market towards low or net zero emissions? Obviously, there are many. Jeff's going to focus on emission trading schemes that are launching and existing in APAC. while Peter will focus more on Article 6 implications. And in these next two slides, I want to focus more on the macro drivers. This slide demonstrates one essential driver, and these are big numbers. There's no reason to focus on any bubble in particular here, but the message is clear. Emissions must fall significantly by 2030, full stop. Companies must change the way they act, and investors must change the way that they manage their money. So there are clear state commitments across Asia. That's important. But perhaps of more importance is that these commitments are already being implemented into financial systems. Primarily, this is through the introduction of ESG criteria, particularly climate disclosure for listed companies across Asian stock exchanges, which has been led by Hong Kong, and impacted China, where listed companies will have to display their ESG status. In Singapore, again, public companies must comply or explain to the SGX how ESG is incorporated within corporations. Australian companies are integrating climate risk within the ASX, and the ASX are asking listed companies to report on what's regarded as material climate risks. And encouragingly, Indonesia and Thailand are integrating sustainability issues into green regulation and stock exchanges. So what about actual climate action? Asia and Australia have been laggards to date when it comes to sustainability. South Pole have had a large project development presence in Asia and Australia for 14 years. Our first sales office didn't appear in Singapore until 2 years ago. An additional driver is the ambition for net zero and the impact on corporates and supply chains across the APAC region. Currently, 77 countries, many cities and large corporates are targeting net zero emissions by 2050, if not 2040. In the first box here, I've dropped some big names in. Nestle committed to net zero. A good example of this commitment is that as a result, a company committed to sustainable agriculture at the highest level, Synlait in New Zealand, have secured long-term contracts with this huge conglomerate. Takeda, Asia's largest pharmaceutical company, shooting for carbon neutrality across the value chain by 2040. ADM, the world's largest food supplier, 2-degree aligned goals and an expansive supply chain across the APAC region. Rio Tinto, the world's second biggest miner, aiming to be net zero by 2050. These are the corporates. Over to the financial sector in the second box, we've got GPIF, the world's largest pension fund, worth $1.5 trillion of investments. They currently have 3-degree alignment and will remain invested in companies that align with the 2-degree target. Temasek want to halve their emissions in their portfolio by 2030, and with $300 billion invested over around 2/3 of that investment in Asia, this is another sizable driver. And the list goes on. Australian Super, MUFG, with substantial sustainable strategies. I like to define carbon offsetting as a transition catalyst. Here we're visualizing how a company may reach net zero. It's impossible right now for many industries to transition towards net zero without the use of carbon offsets as a mechanism, whether trading scheme based or voluntary based. And the clear preference of these companies is to find a way of permanently removing carbon from the atmosphere. As a first measure, a company should and can reduce its emissions through ambitious decarbonisation efforts that are aligned with the level of reduction required by science. As a second step, the company would start investing in carbon removals to tackle these unavoidable emissions. Carbon offsets are not the end solution, absolutely not. But right now, steel makers can't make carbon neutral steel. Concrete makers can't make carbon neutral concrete, and oil and gas producers must use carbon removal units to offset the resultant emissions. The larger emitters are becoming early movers in accessing carbon markets to reduce their net emissions. This graphic is interesting to compare with the previous slide. Red plus refers to efforts to reduce emissions from forest degradation and deforestation, as well as to conserve and sustainably manage forests and carbon stocks. From 2016 to 2018, we've seen a 3-fold increase in Red Plus offset volumes. This is predominantly due to companies searching for permanent removal of carbon from the atmosphere through nature-based solutions. Many of these projects are developed in the APAC region, where a substantial amount of demand has been building over the last 6 to 12 months, which leads to an important side note. Carbon offsets are not just a transition catalyst, but they're a transporter of impact. These projects typically occur in poor communities. We're working on a RED+ project in Rwanda at present. The average income per person there is $500 per year. Carbon offsetting is a wonderful transporter of the Sustainable Development Goals. They have a huge impact on local communities and, of course, ecology. Engaged companies can and do create an interlinked carbon offsetting with a meaningful CSR or investment program. So to summarize what's happening in the voluntary carbon market, very simply, the market demand is growing globally. Within the APAC region, this growth has been substantial over the last 6 months. Coronavirus has impacted a plethora of businesses, yet South Pole have remained surprisingly optimistic that the vast majority of our customers regard their sustainability program as a crucial piece of their long-term business strategy, and it's here to stay. That's a big turnaround from 2008's global financial crisis, when sustainability was dropped quickly by many market participants. The current market demand comes not only from large multinationals, but importantly, real asset owners. And we see many new clients in the APAC region looking to understand the state of the carbon markets, how they can effectively integrate a successful net zero strategy, and with a clear trend of commitment to permanent sequestration of carbon, local impact where possible, and long-term offtake agreements. I hope you found this update useful. I'll now pass to my esteemed colleague, Jeff Swartz, broadcasting from London. Over to you, Jeff.
Well, thank you very much, John, and good afternoon and good evening to all of you. My name is Jeff Swartz. I work for South Pole here in our London team, and I'm responsible for all of the company's strategy and advisory on carbon markets. So it's great to be here with all of you today. Carbon markets and carbon offsetting have been growing as a policy tool and a preferred way for businesses to achieve their net zero commitments for quite some time, as John already pointed out. But just in the past 2 years, the demand for carbon offsets in the voluntary market in particular has dramatically risen. We've seen the world's largest carbon offset standard, Verra, recently published data which has said that they've more than doubled the number of carbon offset issuances that they provided to the market in 2018 alone. That's data from 2 years ago, and we'll start to see the data from 2019 in the coming weeks. So this dramatic rise in demand for carbon offsets is something the market has really never seen before in terms of voluntary demand. And voluntary carbon offsetting from the private sector is a key driver for demand, but another key driver of demand for carbon offsets and the driver of demand for growth in carbon pricing regulations also comes from carbon markets in the Asia Pacific region. So this map shows you the developments in carbon pricing across the region. There's actually a lot to talk about here, and I don't have enough time to talk to you about all of it, but let me just give you a few updates. So let's start by talking about China. The government in China has recently moved to launch a nationwide emissions trading system. That system will build off of 8 original emissions trading system pilots across China's cities and provinces, which have been in operation since 2013. And this national emissions trading system, once it's fully operationalized, is expected to cover more than 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions. That would make it the largest carbon market in the world by far, once it's fully operational. And it's expected in that market in China, the national carbon market, that offsets will be allowed for use. We don't know all the details yet, but that's the signal that the government in China has given out. Looking across China and towards South Korea, South Korea was the first country in Asia to set up an emissions trading system. It's now in its 3rd phase of operation, and more Korean firms will actually have to pay for the emissions that they produce next year than ever before. These same firms can also invest in carbon offset projects as long as they meet the regulations that the Korean government has set. And finally, Singapore has recently launched a carbon tax of around $5 per ton of carbon dioxide emissions. In addition to these three countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, Taiwan, and Thailand are all exploring setting up some form of a carbon pricing regulation or carbon market. This slide gives you a bit more detail about those recent developments that I've just highlighted. This is just high-level information, and I don't have enough time to go through all of it with you in detail, but I encourage you to contact us or Peter at Reed Smith after this webinar to learn more. This next slide really shows you the context around how the demand for carbon offsets will grow, both from voluntary companies offsetting their emissions to meet their voluntary emission reduction pledges, but also from various carbon markets, which are either in development already or will be in development over the coming decade. Our own expectation is that around 30% growth across the next 10 years will come just from the demand for carbon offsets from carbon market regulations. And this figure in this graph, if you look closely, doesn't include the demand that could potentially come from China. In addition to the demand from the various carbon markets that are emerging in Asia and across the world, many of the demand will also come from a new international carbon market for aviation called CORSIA. Now, CORSIA aims to achieve carbon neutral growth for the international aviation sector from 2020 onwards. This is a market that's regulated by ICAO, the international regulatory body for aviation, and carbon neutrality for international aviation will be achieved by airlines either purchasing carbon offsets or by increasing their use of sustainable aviation fuels. Because of the COVID pandemic, we don't know what the demand will be for airlines on carbon offsets. That's something that we're only going to see in the coming years. But we know that 10 countries, actually more than 10 countries in Asia, have already opted in to the first voluntary phase of CORSIA, which starts just next year. This means that a route from Sydney to Singapore, for example, will have to offset its emissions from next year onwards. And CORSIA adopts a route-based approach. So that means if that route is operated by Singapore Airlines or by Qantas, both airlines, as they belong to those two countries, will have to regulate their carbon emissions through carbon offsetting. Now, the other big area for demand on carbon offsets internationally is expected to come from the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And inside the Paris Agreement itself, there is a key provision called Article 6, which allows for countries to cooperate with each other to achieve their emission reduction commitments that they've set out under the Paris Agreement. And Peter's going to talk to you in more detail about this key provision. But before I hand it off to Peter, I wanted to just share with you a few interesting highlights about how this theoretical concept that came about from the Paris Agreement is already starting to happen on the ground in the Asia region. As this new international carbon market is going to be the foundation for international emissions transfers in the future, there are many organizations, including South Pole, which are starting to pilot the first Article 6 projects across Asia. And we've recently launched our own Article 6 pilot in Thailand. In 2018, South Pole began working with an organization called the Climate Sense Foundation, based in Zurich, Switzerland, to explore how to monetize the emission reductions that would come from shifting a large fleet of motorbikes and tuk-tuks in Bangkok from relying on petrol to electric batteries. Under this innovative Article 6 pilot, what we aim to do with the support of the Thai and Swiss governments is to monetize those emissions reductions and have those emissions reductions be transferred to Switzerland, which would use them from reducing its own emission reductions under the Paris Agreement commitments, which it has set. And the Thai government would then receive a substantial form of carbon finance to actually fund this major shift away from relying on fossil fuel in the fleet of light vehicles that you commonly see across Bangkok. And Thailand would not be able to use those emissions reductions in its Paris count. It would have to perform a special accounting formatting procedure, which is a requirement under Article 6. That's a technicality that you might not have heard of, but it's a really important point in order for us to uphold the integrity of this new international carbon market. And I'll now hand over to Peter Zaman of Reed Smith to talk to you about that further. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. And thank you very much to South Pole for the invitation to speak to you all today. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is the market mechanism created in the Paris Agreement. It's the only provision in the Paris Agreement that talks about market mechanisms. Now, this comes off the back of a contrasting situation where, for the purposes of the Kyoto Protocol, we had a number of, we had three market mechanisms to be precise. Now, the problem we have is, of course, the Kyoto Protocol's market mechanisms started petering out after 2012, and the Paris Agreement's marketing mechanisms are meant to replace it, really from 2020 onwards. But in order for them to become operational, we need certain things to be in place. And I'll talk about some of the missing pieces in that jigsaw puzzle. But maybe I'll start by asking the organizers to move to my first slide, please. So Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 are the two subparagraphs within Article 6 that talk about market mechanisms. Article 6.2 is otherwise known as a cooperative approach, and Article 6.4 is otherwise called the Sustainable Development Mechanism, or the SDM. Now, what's the difference between Article 2 and Article 6.2 and Article 6.4? To put it simply, Article 6.4 is a centralized system, not dissimilar from the way in which the CDM operated. In other words, it will be a system dealing in mitigation outcomes. It will be centrally managed by the UN Secretariat, and it will allow host countries to create offsets which can then be sold or through the platform managed and operated by the SDM Secretariat. So it sounds in one sense a bit like the CDM. The main difference is in the CDM under the Kyoto Protocol, only countries that were outside of Annex B of the Kyoto Protocol could participate as a host of a CDM project. Under Article 6.4, frankly, any country can host their SDM activity. Looking at Article 6.2 by way of contrast, Article 6.2 is a bit more like an intergovernmental arrangement, which could be bilateral or it could be multilateral. And essentially, it's broader than just limiting the type of activity to mitigation outcomes. So to the extent that you were looking to participate in some other form of sustainable development activity, adaptation activity, for example, for which you wish to claim some form of credit, you would have to look to do that under Article 6.2, and you wouldn't be able to do that under Article 6.4. One of the other big differences between Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 is how it becomes operational. Article 6.4 requires the centralized systems and bureaucracy of the UN to kick into action for the Article 6.4 market to come into creation. And the Article 6.2 market, because it's essentially a choice between governments, doesn't require that level of bureaucracy, and essentially as long as two bilateral or more than two countries agree on something, they can get a cooperative approach up and running. So the expectation is that cooperative approaches under Article 6.2 will be up and running earlier than the SDM under Article 6.4. The other point just to mention in respect of the distinctions between Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 is that the Paris Agreement makes it very clear that Article 6.4 will allow private sector participation. And in fact, for Article 6.2, the working assumption amongst the public is that it will be something that private sector can participate in, but actually there's no express reference to that in the Paris Agreement. So our view is, of course, as long as the countries involved themselves in a cooperative approach agree to allow private sector participation, then private sector participation should be available for Article 6.2. But looking at the experience we've had of the past, because both are intergovernmental arrangements, there will be government overlay over the participation in project activities that qualify for Article 6 purposes. Theory is, once operational, both Article 6.2 or Article 6.4 will provide a demand for which there will be essentially a opportunity for both private sector as well as government initiatives to lead to offsetting to be generated. Next slide, please. So the nationally determined contributions of each country under the Paris Agreement will have to be updated every 5 years. And the objectives under the Paris Agreement are the updates should increase the level of ambition compared to previous NDCs. So every 5 years, the expectation is for every country that is a member or participant in the Paris Agreement, they should increase their ambition by potentially adding new gases or adding new sectors of the economy within the coverage of the NDC. So that raises a question. If you do have a activity that qualifies under the cooperative approach or an SDC, for it to qualify for the purposes of those two mechanisms, does the activity have to come from within the scope of a published or an announced NDC of that host country? And that's a question for which we don't yet know the answer. The working assumption is you must have it from within the NDC, but could you also have Article 6.2 or Article 6.4 projects that qualify that arise from activity that sits outside of the scope of the NDC? Now that question should be answered by the Article 6 guidelines that the United Nations Convention, Framework Convention is discussing and was supposed to discuss at the COP that was meant to be hosted in Glasgow, theoretically later this year, but it's been postponed because of the pandemic. And actually just this morning, I read that the UK government is proposing November 2021 as the date for the hosting of that Glasgow COP. Now, if that's the case, we've got a while to wait before we get to those Article 6 guidelines. But going back to my earlier point, because countries are eager to get going, a lot of countries who are eager to try and generate Article 6.2 opportunities, particularly as soon as possible, they will do so without waiting for those Article 6.2 guidelines to be published. Of course, if the determination is made in those guidelines that your Article 6.2 activity or Article 6.4 activity must come from sectors that fall within the scope of your NDC only, then it raises the question about, well, does that mean voluntary markets that you've been hearing John and Jeff describe are therefore the place for activities that sit outside of those NDCs? Next slide, please. Now, if you think about the fact that some projects that are currently voluntary projects sit outside the scope of any NDC, because the NDCs only really become live and active from the 1st of January 2021. So current project activity that we call voluntary market activity has up till now existed outside of the regulatory framework for any country. But if a country wishes to ensure that it maximizes its domestic opportunities for activity that falls within Article 6.2 or Article 6.4, the expectation is that that country will start regulating activity that falls within its scope of its NDC. Now, what each country will do by way of regulatory framework is unclear. We have had past experience of some countries like China during the CDM essentially nationalizing pollution and emissions as part of its regulatory framework, which meant you couldn't host a CDM project without getting local Chinese NDRC approval. Now, if that's an approach taken by countries in order to regulate their carbon inventory, essentially, then it raises the question as to what happens to voluntary activity that currently either sits within the scope of that country's NDC or outside the scope of that NDC. Next slide, please. So I've created a table here that hopefully tries to illustrate the world as it stands today. So we think cooperative approaches and sustainable development mechanism activity falling inside the scope of an NDC will definitely allow to qualify for Article 6.2 processes and Article 6.4 processes. I've put square brackets around the cooperative approaches and SDM in the context of outside NDC because we just don't know what's going to happen there. But we do know that current activity that we consider to be eligible for CORSIA purposes or voluntary markets purposes will probably have to sit from outside the NDC at a minimum. And there are some countries, notably the United States, who will not be at present a member of the Paris Agreement, and therefore any activity that sits in the United States won't count towards activity that needs to be accounted for under the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So this slide is very similar to the previous slide, with the exception of highlighting the fact that as time goes by and countries increase their ambition, the scope of project activity in gases and sectors that fall within the inside of an NDC are expected to grow over time. And therefore, the sectors that are inside the NDCs will become bigger, and the scope of the world that sits outside the NDC over time will become smaller. I didn't want to hazard a guess of where a number of countries might be, whether inside or outside the Paris Agreement over time. We'll have to see whether or not the position adopted by the United States is an outlier or the beginning of a trend. I expect it's an outlier based on everything we've been hearing and seeing ever since the announcement, but you can never tell about what the world will hold in the future. That's, I've got my one last slide to go through, so the next slide, please. So the point about this slide is it's a study done about Article 6.4 demand by an organization called Carbon Brief. And what I find very interesting about their modeling is that if you look closely, China starts out in their expectations as a net seller of carbon offsets. And by the time it sort of hits 2050, it switches over from being a net seller to a net buyer. And that's true of a number of other countries. What we're seeing, and this is particularly interesting in the context of Asia, is that over the period of time, except for China, many other Asian countries are essentially going to be net sellers for a long time. What that tells you is that the source of project opportunities really sit in Asia. Africa will probably also switch from being a net seller to a net buyer like China over time. But we don't know what exactly the supply and demand will be. As with all other models, it's subject to a number of assumptions. But nonetheless, I thought this was an interesting diagram that highlighted how a country over time, as it increases its emissions, can become switch from being a seller of offsets to a buyer of offsets. So that's all I really wanted to say. I'm very happy to take some questions, and I think we've got a Q&A session, so I'll hand back over to Leah. Thank you.
From your presentation, it's clear that despite the current effects of COVID-19 on some industries, climate action in Asia, both voluntary and compliance, is on the rise. We now have some time for questions and answers with our speakers. I will start with one of the most frequently asked questions to warm up our speakers and give everyone a few minutes to digest the presentations. We'll then move on to other questions asked throughout the presentation. So one question that has come up a lot is about the impact of the coronavirus on the carbon markets. Our experts have touched base on these topics throughout the webinar, but now is a chance for them to go into a bit more detail. John, can I hand it over to you?
Sure, Leah. I guess it's more probably an opinion based on what we're seeing in the market right now as to really what the full repercussion will be from coronavirus. But it's very clear to us that given the groundswell for sustainability and climate action that we saw in the first quarter of this year, that absolutely companies very much are committed to their sustainability strategies, obviously barring those industries which have been catastrophically hurt by what's happening. Obviously, airlines immediately and the travel and tourism sector. Although, even saying that, we have still been working with 2 or 3 large global operators within that industry to put frameworks in place for climate action for the foreseeable future. So I think the gut reaction on my side, at least now, is surprisingly optimistic.
Thanks, John. Jeff, Peter, would you want anything to add here, or?
Jeff, why don't you go first?
Sorry,
Okay.
I was waiting to be unmuted. Sorry, thank you. Indeed, I wanted to just echo John's point. I mean, carbon offsets and carbon markets are large value chains. So obviously there's an impact on demand from the sectors that John pointed out, but there's also impact on the supply. You know, the projects and the activities that take place which actually generate emissions reductions are also affected by COVID. But the important thing to remind everybody is if we stop providing these sources of carbon finance, these same projects, these same communities will be even more vulnerable to the effects of this awful pandemic. So I think it's important to look at the situation from both lenses. And I think from a policy perspective, obviously governments have very important priorities right now, which is securing our public health. But I'm very hopeful that many countries see the connection between how this pandemic happened in the first place and how to lead us out of this economic devastation through a low carbon and a climate friendly way. Not every government potentially will do that, but it's incumbent upon all of us who understand the science and the urgency of climate change to remind our governments that we don't have any time to waste.
So Jeff, just to add to that, I mean, I do agree with you that the pandemic creates a real shift in perspective that we've never had before. So people have always known about climate change as a threat or as a danger, but very often they were able to sort of put the impact of it into the back of their mind because a lot of the impact was long-term and not short-term. What the pandemic has done is it's drawn a number of parallels between the need or the significance of what can happen if you don't tackle a problem, and particularly when you know where the problem is foreseeable. A lot of people will say to you, was the pandemic foreseeable? And the answer to that's going to be pretty much yes. I mean, if Ebola wasn't a warning, what was a warning, right? And now you've got governments having to handle the consequences of a problem that was foreseeable that they did not deal with. And climate change falls exactly and squarely within that same situation. So what you get actually by way of response for a lot of progressive governments is a realization at this point that the trend that we saw in 2018 and 2019, particularly with increased, enhanced awareness, understanding for ESG, is absolutely the right way to move forward. Now, whether or not you want to create a carbon market to generate demand, or whether or not you want to create a bottom-up approach at every single individual company level to ensure we all do the right thing by way of environment or other ESG criteria, the bottom line is that is a movement that I don't see going to change as a result of the pandemic. Yes, there will be squeezes on finances, but just like the European governments are now being asked to do, a lot of bailout is now being tied to conditions about what you're going to do about the environment as part of a condition for receiving the bailout. Now, that's more progressive than it was in 2008. So I would say that we've moved a long way from the last financial crisis. And of course, we're closer to the start of the Paris Agreement. We're closer to, of course, the, if you will, the deadline by which really action must be taken. And all of those things mean that we can't really kick this particular can down the line.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Actually, there's one more question that came in for you. Are NDCs legally binding?
NDCs are binding because the Paris Agreement is binding on the countries that ratified. I think the question is slightly different. I think if I were to ask the question by playing devil's advocate, I would frame the questions differently. I would say, what happens as a matter of the Paris Agreement if a country ignores its obligations under an NDC? Now, I think the answer to that is there's not a lot of teeth in the Paris Agreement itself. But one of the things that I'm afraid President Trump has done in the last couple of years, he's opened a particular can of worms called trade wars and tariffs. And anybody who doesn't play by the rules of the Paris Agreement on a collective basis is likely to feel that kind of equivalent weapon being thrown in their direction. Now, if at the moment the person wielding that weapon is much more the US, but you can see that US has wielded that weapon already against a number of countries, most recently China. And in China's defense, they've retaliated by doing exactly the same thing, by slapping a number of tariffs against the US. So in a world where nobody is playing by the rules or everybody ignores their obligations under the NDCs, then that is always the fallback available to those countries who wish to enhance or support the obligations of the Paris Agreement. So that's where the teeth comes from. It's not direct, it's indirect.
Thank you, Peter. And now we're moving on to the next question, which is more targeting the voluntary carbon market, and hence we're switching over to John. How can a mining company, like for example Rio Tinto, reach net zero emissions? Would they also have to offset the carbon released by the usage of their products, for example by burning of fossil fuels?
Right. I mean, a lot of carbon reduction and net zero is about where you set your scopes, what emissions you're going to include within scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And I don't think it's appropriate to dive too far into the technical details of net zero because, and I think it's an important point, if we look at net zero, if we look at any other strategy to decarbonize, like the science-based targets, right now, absolutely, there is no way to decarbonize fully in many, many industries. It's just not impossible. You know, science-based targets and net zero are ultimate goals and ultimate outcomes here. So right now, you know, mining companies, etc., can decarbonize and have an internal decarbonization strategy, but without a doubt, they will have to look for resources such as permanent removal of carbon via carbon offsets and other technologies. It simply is not possible for many companies to decarbonize fully and reach net zero as it stands right now. And I referred to that earlier in terms of carbon really helping that transition. So yeah, fossil fuel burning is still very much a part of most companies and how they operate, and it will be. Just like airlines, there are alternative technologies. They are not ready yet. Carbon offsets must be a viable alternative for these strategies.
Great, thank you, John. And now one question that goes more into the compliance markets for Peter and Jeff. I think it's a question that we have actually touched base a bit, or Peter has mentioned it in his presentation, but because it came a number of times, I think it makes sense to bring that up here. Given that all countries have obligations under the Paris Agreement, do you see that impacting the opportunities to generate voluntary credits? Won't host countries rather want to use those projects to meet their own targets instead of having private developers to sell those credits abroad?
Jeff, shall I go first? So I think it's the point I was, Leah, as you rightly say, I was alluding to when I did my presentation. I call it the nationalisation risk, because if you are a country who over time has an ambition to increase your, has the objective of increasing your ambition over time, then by definition, more sectors and more gases will fall within the scope of your NDC. Now, that means things that fall within the scope of your NDC are potentially there for you to use for your own purposes, which means that the availability of offsets for you to sell starts reducing. It's the reason why, in my example, China initially starts off as a seller because it has more gases and more sectors that sit outside of its NDC. And as over time it increases its ambitions, it has less sectors available to it, and therefore it has to keep those sectors and activity within that sector within its own inventory and its own NDC compliance, and therefore it becomes a net buyer over time. So absolutely, that's how the Paris Agreement is meant to work. So that's part of the reason why Asia remains an attractive place as a host for a lot of offset projects. And the Paris Agreement theoretically benefits Asia and Africa in a way that it doesn't benefit many other countries. So, you know, it's a supply and demand question, but really, Jeff, I think you'll see that there's a similar overlap once a country adopts a compliance role as to what happens to gases under that sector.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add to that, apart from saying this is a question that, you know, we're working on every day at South Pole. It's core to our work. I think a couple of things. First is we shouldn't lose sight of what an achievement the Paris Agreement is. It sets targets for all countries for the very first time in history. That's awesome. Whether or not the carbon market ebbs and flows, to me, the most important thing is how do we get all countries to move in the same direction and to take meaningful actions that get us to a point in our collective endeavors to stabilize temperature increase at well below 1.5 degrees. The carbon market and carbon offset, for me personally, that comes later, right? But saying that, I work in the carbon market and I work on carbon offsets, so I want these mechanisms to thrive. I think to add to what Peter said, certainly there is some risk that some projects would no longer continue to issue carbon credits because they become nationalized by a host country government. But I think we're going to see over the next few years how different countries adopt different policy approaches to this issue. There's not going to be a universal one-size-fits-all approach to this issue. We shouldn't expect that to come from the UN climate negotiations under Article 6. There's no guidance for that. So it's going to be a plethora of different countries tracking different greenhouse gas inventories, and whether or not a carbon offset project gets included in that or not, we'll have to figure that out. Our message to governments is you should have it all. Don't expect that you can be able to fund and finance all these activities. I mean, governments are cash strapped at the moment. We all know that. There's no country in the world that can fund all emission reduction projects that are foreseeable in its own borders. I mean, maybe Liechtenstein can, right? But certainly not a major emerging economy like we see in Southeast Asia. So I think the message to government should be the private sector has a fundamental role to play to help finance the emissions reductions that can be achieved under your NDC. And that should hopefully give governments the green light to continue to allow for emission reduction projects to generate offsets for the voluntary sector.
Thanks, Jeff. That's great. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but we have 2 minutes left for one of the last questions. And this question is actually one for all of you. With most companies working towards a net zero or carbon neutral target, do you think the cost of offsets will increase and the availability of offsets reduce? Maybe I just hand over to Peter as our guest of honor to answer the question first, and then maybe Jeff and John, you can. pointless answer.
Thanks, Lee. I'll keep it short to make sure everybody else gets a chance to get a word in. I think the answer to that is, in short, yes. We are in a carbon-constrained world. There is a recognition of that, and therefore the demand for these credits is on the increase. I see that in the work I do for clients every day. That's enough from me. Over to Jeff and to John.
I mean, I've worked in carbon markets long enough to be very careful about saying prices will rise and by how much. You know, the carbon market is one where the history is quite muddled and murky, and in terms of its growth and price rises and crashes, particularly that we saw with the CDM. I don't think that we can say carbon prices will rise everywhere. I think that we're going to be living in a decade of fragmented carbon prices. Different countries have different policies. They might be emissions trading systems, they might be carbon taxes. And in those policies, some sectors will be covered and some might not. So you can be a oil and gas or a mining company, and you might be in under regulation in some carbon markets over here and might not be in some over there. So you're going to be paying different prices and you're going to be falling under different scopes. For the voluntary market, however, I think the demand that I was alluding to that will come from CORSIA and Article 6 and all these new carbon markets that are going to emerge over the next decade, I'm talking for the next 10 years, there's going to be more demand for the same carbon offsets that companies are buying today to achieve their net zero commitments than we'll see down the road 10 years from now. So the supply is ultimately going to shrink because of the constraints around Article 6 and accounting of emissions reductions, and the demand is going to increase because more companies are going to be offsetting and more governments are going to be allowing offsets to be used for compliance in carbon markets. So you can be the judge of that and decide whether or not you think the price will rise, but certainly the fundamentals to me look like supply will shrink over the coming years.
Thanks, Jeff. That's great. Anything from you, John?
Look, I have nothing more to add to those comments other than sustainability is cheap right now. Right now, sustainability, being sustainable, buying carbon is cheap. And clearly, as Jeff said, the fundamentals are there will be more companies wanting to be more sustainable. There's a clear driver there. Whether that increases or decreases prices, you can take that as you will. But right now, to commit and to transition into being a more sustainable company is very economically efficient right now.
Thanks, John. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Peter. That's it from our Q&A. I now hand over to Gabby. Thank you, everyone, for switching on.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for such a great discussion. It's a shame we ran out of time because there were some great questions coming through, but we do want to continue the conversation. So the contact details are on the next slide. But if you do want to talk to us or join us for other climate chatters on other related topics later this month, we've got a couple coming up, one on greenhouse gas calculation and assurance that we're hosting with TÜV Nord, also for the Asia Pacific region, and another on building resilient supply chains. So if you visit the Climate Chatter webpage, links there, you can find out more details on registering. And yeah, thank you for joining us. We'll send out a recording and wrap up within the week, including a follow-up survey, which we'd really appreciate you filling out so we can see how we went. And in the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with our experts with any questions, or if you have any other comments, please do. Otherwise, thank you and have a good rest of your day or a good evening.